Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Seed Speaks. This is a video series brought to you by Seed World Group. My name is Rebecca Carmeli Peslak, and I am the digital media producer for Seed World Group. Today, we are talking about El Nino versus La Nina. What are they really? El Nino and La Nina are commonly discussed weather patterns, but do you understand what they actually are? Weather can be unpredictable, but do these weather patterns give us some insight into what to expect in the future? Learn more today as we dissect the weather patterns, as well as the similarities and differences between them on today's episode of Seed Speaks. Take a deep dive into El Nino and La Nina as we kick off our season covering the wild world of weather. Today, to discuss El Nino versus La Nina, I am joined by two experts, Sean Hackett, president of Hackett Financial Advisors, and Steve Wilkins, agronomy manager for the Central Business Unit with Syngenta. Sean and Steve, thank you both so much for joining me today and bringing your expertise to Seed Speaks. Sean, would you mind introducing yourself to our audience?
Yeah, my name is Sean Hackett, president of Hackett Financial Advisors. We specialize in using statistics, cycles, and correlations as it pertains really to climate to be able to project out likely weather patterns and help make good price forecasts for those on the production side of agriculture.
Thank you so much, Sean. And Steve, could you also introduce yourself to our audience?
Yeah, greetings everyone. Steve Wilkins. I work with Syngenta in agronomy, and I manage a component of our seed agronomists and the central component of the Corn Belt of the United States. So I reside in eastern Wisconsin, and that's home for myself.
Well, thank you both for being here today. Let's get into it. Sean, I'll kick this one off with you. What is El Nino? What is La Nina?
The terms refer to the sea surface temperatures in the central and eastern Pacific. When those sea surface temperatures are plus 0.5 degrees Celsius colder than normal, it's called a La Nina. You have sinking air, and it causes a certain upper airflow pattern that produces some extreme weather events like drought in the US, for example. El Nino is when those same sea surface temperatures are 0.5 degrees warmer than normal. You have rising air, and it kind of reverses the upper airflow pattern to where you once had drought, you tend to have a more wet, cooler pattern historically. So, for example, the U.S. tends to be more wet and cool during times of El Nino. There's a lot of other regional tendencies for that. But then when we're referring to those two key patterns, recognition patterns, we're really referring to those sea surface temperatures of the Pacific that really help drive a lot of these weather patterns and determine what kind of production risks we have in various parts of the world.
Thank you for that. Steve, is there anything you wanted to add there?
No, the thing I would just highlight is Sean gave a great overview of the trends, but even within them, we sometimes get micro areas that are really challenging from a crop production standpoint to manage. Too much heat, too little, too much water. So the weather complex, whether it's El Nino or La Nina or the transition of them, is very problematic for the row crop producer to have to evaluate and to find a way through each and every year.
Sure, that makes sense. And which weather pattern are we currently in, or are we in that transitional phase?
We were in a transitional phase from, let's say, the middle of the spring into the end of the summer, and we have officially transitioned to an El Nino weather pattern. But I want to dovetail what Steve just said about micro patterns. Not every El Nino is the same. There's different strengths and there's different flavors of El Nino. One of the things that we see in this particular El Nino is that it's going to morph into what's called an El Nino modici. That's when the sea surface temperatures are focused on the center of the Pacific and are cooler on the East Pacific. When we get that kind of a weather pattern, it tends to produce a different set of weather variables than if it's a normal El Nino, where the warm waters come off the east and are evenly distributed to the center. So, for example, in a normal El Nino, Brazil would generally speaking have favorable weather during the prime growing season from December through the spring. In El Nino Mordecai, you actually tend to get significant increases in drought risks for that northern half of Brazil, especially central west in a region called Mato Grosso, where significant corn is produced. They call it the Safrina second crop corn. We estimate about 60 to 70% of the corn would be at risk from this weather pattern, and approximately 60 to 65% of the soybeans could be at risk of this pattern. So that is something to definitely watch and pay attention to, because it's very, very different from the last El Nino we had. And I think a lot of forecasters are not picking up on or not thinking about how this El Nino might provide some fireworks for the Brazilian crop, and hence the potential for some opportunities for better prices in the winter months that maybe producers here in the U.S. can sell into.
Interesting. Steve, did you want to add anything to that?
No, that was very, very well said by Sean.
Well, Steve, my next question, I will direct it to you. How do we see, the impacts of these weather patterns impact on farms?
That's a great question, and let's take a larger look. The phrase that I like to use with my customers that I work with is weatherproofing your farms, because we'll know the trends. Are we going into a El Nino, La Nina? Are we in a transitional state? Those will typically guide us on what we're going to look forward to a year. So if we have really good information and data that shows we're going to head into a wetter pattern or a drier pattern, we will make recommendations with farmers down from the specific corn and soybean hybrids that we're going to position on a farm, and then management practices that we're going to want to carry out as well. So when I look at each of these, I think all farmers, and in my case, the Midwestern farmer, we've gotten significantly better at managing weather extremes. In some cases in this year, we didn't have the heat of what we did in, say, a 2012, but some areas certainly had the dryness. And we saw that last year too. But with added technologies and a lot better agronomics, our yields were far superior on an individual and on a national scale to what they were a decade ago. I think that goes back to how seed companies are looking at products, and how we, myself as agronomists, are really dialing in on practices to help mitigate these weather risks. And they're vast. Too much rain is just as detrimental as too little when it boils right down to potential yield loss.
Thank you for your insight there. Sean, did you want to add anything to the impacts that these weather patterns have on farmers?
I mean, the only thing that I would add is what kind of crop insurance you choose can be very important based upon the likely weather pattern. In addition to that, there's certainly things you can do, with managing risk with hedges, call options, put options, that farmers can use to try to help mitigate some of that risk. So, for example, if you're a cattle producer, and you have a need for corn feed, and you're worried that there could be some issues with that, and you're not comfortable, or you don't have the finances to go buy a whole bunch of cash corn too far into the future, you can do some of these protective hedges to make sure that the risks are mitigated should they occur, and provide that upward swing in your feed costs.
Yeah, to Sean's point there, Rebecca, from a production standpoint, there is only so many things. There's only so many levers that can be pulled. So even though I wear an agronomist hat, I definitely go back to Sean's point. Risk management from a marketing standpoint is so key to the foundational success of not just the customers that we work with, but all row crop farming producers in general. You really got to mix and match them both up. I think they have a true viable option going forward to managing these extremes that we have weather-wise. And so there's two elements of risk. There's production risk and there's marketing risk.
Thank you. I really appreciate that insight. I guess that can lead us into my next question. Of course, either of you, please feel free to answer. How can we continue to prepare for El Nino versus La Nina? And then is there a preference of one to the other for farmers?
I'll take a first stab at it. I mean, is there a preference? We can look at what the data says, and typically lack of moisture is what it is, but it's heat. Heat is what really makes or breaks a crop. So when we're in weather patterns that give us excessive amounts of temperature, that's tough to manage from a producing standpoint. When our nights don't cool down, when the plants don't have a chance to cool off and respire, we tend to see yields decrease. So these warmer patterns, it's a little bit more difficult to drive top end yield. We tend to see yields back down. On the cooler, wetter, and a little bit more favorable, especially for like a corn production. Those years tend to really increase what we see from a yield standpoint. We're reducing the stresses on the plant. So, some of it might depend to kind of know where you're at, but I would take as if I'm a row crop producer and I want to produce high amounts of corn and soybeans, a little bit cooler would probably be the area that I'd want to focus on. But going forward, as Sean alluded to earlier, it doesn't necessarily look like that's going to be in our forecast here coming over the next 2 to 3 or so years.
Thank you for that, Steve. Sean, anything to add there?
I mean, certainly the temperature is the key in my view. We can manage a lot of different moisture profiles, but the heat, if it's too long and too persistent, very, very hard to manage that. Certainly, a producer would rather have that typical El Nino weather pattern, cooler, wetter, to produce the bigger crops. Even if there's too much rain at times, it's still easier to manage that. But the La Nina weather pattern, which at least for the North America, brings that high heat levels in, that's more problematic. And so certainly, in a perfect world, the producer here in the U.S. would want El Nino every year.
Makes sense. I'm actually going to stop and take an audience question from Ashley Robinson. How do extreme weather events factor into El Nino and La Nina cycles?
Well, I mean, if we look around the globe, there are certain patterns. And once again, no El Nino La Nina is exactly the same. There's a lot of different flavors and iterations, but generally speaking, a La Nina means production in South America and in North America tend to be compromised, meaning the weather tends to be unfavorable for producing crops in those key regions. Out in Asia, India, Southeast Asia, we tend to get much, much better, much more productive weather. Even in Russia, much more productive weather. When we get the El Nino pattern, it's literally kind of reversing those patterns where the North and South America, generally speaking, will have more favorable weather, and you look for overseas in Asia, in Russia, in those regions, Australia, where they can have more difficult patterns. So, for example, let's equate that to what's going on right now. Australia dealing with very serious drought right now. India just finished a very, very poor monsoon season. Thailand just had a very, very poor monsoon season. These are all typically manifestations of an El Nino weather pattern, and crop production in those regions are being dialed down as we speak, as the crop is becoming more clear that the weather has impacted it. So those are the kind of things that like Steve had mentioned, you kind of look at what the probabilities are, and then you factor in all your agronomic processes and marketing risk management processes to mitigate them as much as you possibly can.
Thanks for that, Sean. Steve, anything you wanted to add there?
No, I can't. I can't top that. So great response, Sean.
Thank you.
Thanks for that insight again. So do these weather patterns give us insight to the future that can be used for producers? Either of you can take this one off, that's fine.
Well, I think as Steve and I have said, if so for example, the next 2 to 3 years, it looks like we're going to be moving more into a La Nina alignment pattern. A lot of heat and dryness. So if we're looking out over the next 2 to 3 years with a pretty likely probabilistic pathway towards a warmer, drier pattern and potentially some extreme heat, because we seem to be in a weather pattern of increased weather volatility, then one should absolutely be thinking about planning and risk managing and ensuring and handling their agronomic practices for those risks versus a cooler weather pattern, which does not look like that's the trajectory, at least for the next 2 to 3 years.
Yes, and that would also match up with some longer term cycles too that Sean continually talks about, where just it appears as if 24, 25, we should be planning on some drier and likely some warmer temperatures and stuff coming our way, and growers should be willing and ready to prepare for that.
Awesome. Now we've talked a lot about El Nino and La Nina. Are there any other weather patterns that we can refer to, maybe in between these two or that happen at different times?
I mean, a couple of the things that we follow from a sea surface temperature perspective. One's called the Indian Ocean dipole. It's simply the difference between the sea surface temperatures of the West Indian Ocean to the East Indian Ocean. There are times it can be very positive where the West is warmer. That's what we have right now, a positive Indian Ocean dipole. It can be very negative. Sometimes it can be neutral. The give and take with Indian Ocean dipole can be very significant for Asia specifically, meaning that when you have a positive Indian Ocean dipole, it tends to suck moisture away from Asia, away from Australia, and cause a lot of issues with rice production, with wheat production, with some of those key crops out that way. And so that's one variable. The other variable that we try to follow, which is a longer term cycle, is called the Atlantic multidecadal oscillation, or it's a way of measuring the sea surface temperature trends in the Atlantic. Right now, we have a very warm Atlantic Ocean. When you have a warm Atlantic Ocean, it tends to produce hot weather extremes in those regions that are impacted by El Nino and La Nina for high temperatures. So if you think this through, La Nina, as an example, means hot weather for the U.S., and warm Atlantic means even more hot weather for the U.S. So when you have those two cycles combined at the same time, it means you could be having a order of magnitude of heat risks beyond what is historically expected or typically seen. And so that's where the risks to managing the crop can be challenging, because once you start pushing 95 or 100 degrees or more, it's very, very difficult to manage those risks if it persists for any period of time.
Definitely. Steve, anything you wanted to add there?
Nope, I'm not the expert on the transitional thing. So Sean, thanks for taking that one.
Totally. It's really interesting to learn that there is more than just the two that we so often hear of. Well, thank you to Sean and Steve for joining me today on Seed Speaks to discuss El Nino and La Nina. I really enjoyed learning from both of you and being able to share all of this wonderful information and expertise with our audience. Next week on Seed Speaks, join Madeline to learn about plant breeding for better crops to combat wild weather. Thank you again to everyone who joined, and have a great week.